My family threw me out like yesterday's trash when I turned 18, choosing my brother's baseball dreams over my future. Now they're standing at my doorstep, suitcases in hand, begging to move into the mansion they once said I'd never be able to afford. Life has a twisted sense of humor, doesn't it? My name is Sophia Martinez, and this is how I went from sleeping in my car to owning the most expensive property in the county. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I grew up in Oakridge, a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and dreams rarely extended beyond the county line. Our house was modest but comfortable, a 3-bedroom ranch with faded blue siding, and a yard just big enough for backyard barbecues and my younger brother Mateo's endless baseball practice. My parents, Elena and Diego Martinez, worked at the local factory that manufactured auto parts. The pay wasn't great, but it was stable, and they took pride in being hardworking, practical people. From my earliest memories, it was clear where my parents' priorities lay. Mateo was 4 years younger than me, but from the moment he could grip a baseball, my parents saw a future star. He's got a natural talent, my dad would beam to neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who would listen. Scout from the minor leagues said he's never seen a kid throw like that. Whether this scout actually existed or was just part of my father's elaborate fantasy, I'll never know. What I do know is that while Mateo's baseball equipment got more expensive and his training more intensive, my own interests were treated as frivolous distractions. I discovered my passion for computer programming when I was 12. Our school had received a donation of slightly outdated computers, and our teacher, Ms. Patel, started an after-school coding club. The first time I wrote a program that actually worked, a simple calculator that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide, I felt a rush of excitement unlike anything I'd experienced before. Look what I made! I showed my parents the program, proud of my creation. Dad glanced at the screen and shrugged. That's nice, honey, but don't get too caught up in these computer games. Focus on your regular studies. It's not a game, Dad. I tried to explain. I wrote this program myself. Ms. Patel says I have a natural aptitude for coding. Mom patted my shoulder absently while packing Mateo's lunch for his weekend tournament. That's nice, Sophia, but let's be realistic. People like us don't become computer programmers. Those jobs are for people from big cities who go to fancy colleges. I learned quickly to keep my achievements to myself. When I won the regional coding competition in 9th grade, I didn't even bother showing my parents the trophy. It sat in my locker at school until Ms. Patel insisted on displaying it in the computer lab. Talent like yours deserves recognition, Sophia, she told me. If only my family felt the same way. Our home was a shrine to Mateo's athletic achievements. Trophies lined the mantel, newspaper clippings covered the refrigerator, and a special shelf in the living room was dedicated to baseballs from his most important games. Meanwhile, my academic awards and certificates were stuffed in a drawer in my room, occasionally acknowledged with a distracted "good job" before conversation switched back to Mateo's latest pitching stats. It wasn't that my parents were cruel, they just had tunnel vision when it came to success. In their minds, Mateo's baseball skills were the family's lottery ticket, our one shot at something better than the grinding factory work that had worn down their bodies and spirits. My straight A's were expected, his home runs were celebrated. The summer before my senior year of high school, something unexpected happened. My computer science teacher nominated me for a prestigious coding camp at MIT. It was a 2-week program for promising high school students, all expenses paid except for transportation. When the acceptance letter arrived, I was ecstatic. This was my chance to see what was possible beyond Oakridge, to learn from actual professors and meet other students who shared my passion. Absolutely not, Dad said when I showed him the letter. Who's going to drive Mateo to his summer league games? Your mother has the early shift, and I've got the late one. I could take the bus to Boston, I suggested. It's only for 2 weeks. And this could help me get scholarships for college. Mom shook her head. It's too far, Sophia. What if something happens? Besides, college is expensive, even with scholarships. We're putting what we can save toward Mateo's training. That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. She needs to be realistic, Dad said. These computer dreams are setting her up for disappointment. She's smart, Mom replied. She can get a practical degree at the community college, teaching, or nursing, something stable. I bit my pillow to muffle my sobs. They had already decided my future, and it had nothing to do with what I wanted or what I was good at. Against their wishes, I found a way to attend the coding camp. Miss Patel arranged for me to carpool with a teacher from a neighboring district who was driving her son to a science program in Cambridge. I worked extra shifts at my part-time job at the grocery store to save spending money. I didn't exactly lie to my parents. I just told them I was doing an intensive computer science course at the community college and would be staying late most days. Those 2 weeks changed everything. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, both literally and figuratively. The professors didn't treat coding as a hobby or a waste of time. They showed us how it could change the world. I met students from across the country who had built apps and websites, who talked about startups and Silicon Valley like they were discussing plans for the weekend. One of the instructors, Dr. Rivera, took a special interest in my work. You have raw talent, she told me after reviewing my project, a program that helped small businesses organize inventory and predict restocking needs. With the right education and mentorship, you could go far in this field. When she mentioned college applications and scholarships, I confessed my parents' lack of support. Dr. Rivera frowned. Unfortunately, that's not uncommon, especially for young women in tech. But there are options: need-based scholarships, work-study programs, student loans. She gave me her card. Email me when you start applying to colleges. I'd be happy to write you a recommendation letter. I returned home, energized and determined. I would find a way to pursue my passion, with or without my parents' blessing. I started researching colleges with strong computer science programs that offered generous financial aid. I stayed up late working on coding projects that could strengthen my application. I maintained my perfect GPA while working 20 hours, a week to save for application fees and eventual college expenses. Senior year flew by in a blur of classes, work, and secret college applications. When the acceptances started rolling in, including one from a prestigious tech university that offered me a substantial scholarship, I finally got up the courage to tell my parents. I've been accepted to Westfield Tech, I announced one night, at dinner. They're offering me a scholarship that covers 75% of tuition. I can cover the rest with loans and working part-time. The silence that followed was deafening. Mateo stared at his plate. Dad set down his fork with a deliberate calm that was more frightening than shouting. "When did you apply to colleges without discussing it with us?" he asked. I tried to discuss it. "You weren't interested." "Because we already discussed your future," Mom cut in. "Community college, remember? Something practical, close to home." "This is practical," I insisted. "Computer science graduates are in high demand. The starting salaries are— And who's going to pay for the part not covered by scholarships?" Dad interrupted. "We've been clear that our savings are going toward Mateo's training. He has a real shot at a professional career." "And I don't?" I felt my face growing hot. "I've been accepted to one of the top tech schools in the country, but that doesn't count as a real shot at success?" "It's not the same," Mom said softly. "Baseball is— It's more of a sure thing." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Professional baseball, where less than 1% of high school players ever make it to the major leagues, was a sure thing, but a degree in one of the fastest-growing fields wasn't. "I'm going," I said firmly. "I've figured out the finances. I don't need your money." Dad's face hardened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If you choose this path, you're on your own. Completely on your own. We can't waste our resources on a pipe dream when your brother has a real future to prepare for. Diego, Mom gasped. She's still our daughter. And she needs to respect our decisions as her parents, he shot back. We know what's best. I looked at my mother, hoping for support, but she avoided my eyes. Mateo still hadn't looked up from his plate. Fine, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tears threatening to spill. I'll be on my own. Things deteriorated quickly after that night. The house became a battleground of cold silences and tense exchanges. My parents alternated between ignoring my college plans and trying to talk me out of them. The tech industry is too competitive, they'd say. Those jobs will all be outsourced. What about starting a family someday? You can't do that with a demanding career. I withdrew into myself, spending more time at school, at work, or at the local library. Home didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a place I slept and showered between my real life elsewhere. The breaking point came a week after my 18th birthday, which had passed with minimal acknowledgement. A store-bought cake after Mateo's baseball practice and a card with $20 inside. I had just received my final scholarship letter, confirming that I could actually make Westfield Tech work financially if I lived frugally and worked through school. I've confirmed my enrollment at Westfield, I told my parents that evening. Classes start in August, so I'll need to move into the dorms by mid-July. Dad looked up from his newspaper. You're really going through with this? Yes, it's what I want. It's what I'm good at. He folded the newspaper carefully, a bad sign. When Dad took time to gather his thoughts, the explosion that followed was usually worse. Well then, you should start looking for your own place now, he said calmly. If you're adult enough to make this decision against our wishes, you're adult enough to live on your own. What? I stared at him, not comprehending. You heard me. You have until the end of the month. That's 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. Diego! Mom looked shocked. She doesn't have anywhere to go. She's made her choice, Elena. His voice was ice cold. Mateo's summer showcase is coming up. We need to focus our attention and resources there. Professional scouts will be attending. So that's it? I asked, my voice breaking. You're kicking me out because I want to go to college instead of being Mateo's personal chauffeur for the summer? Don't be dramatic, Sophia, Dad snapped. You're choosing to leave this family by disregarding our plans for your future. Actions have consequences. I looked at my mother, silently pleading. She wrung her hands in her lap. Maybe you could reconsider? Community college for a year or two, then transfer? That way you could still help with Mateo and... That's your concern right now? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not that Dad is throwing me out, but that there won't be anyone to drive Mateo to baseball practice? Don't talk to your mother like that, Dad warned. I turned to Mateo, who'd been silent throughout the exchange. At 14, he was already taller than me, with Dad's broad shoulders and Mom's expressive eyes, currently wide with discomfort. Do you have anything to say? I asked him. He glanced at Dad, then back at his plate. I didn't ask for any of this, he mumbled. No, you didn't, I agreed. But you've never once stood up for me either. I left the table and went to my room, slamming the door behind me. Through the thin walls, I could hear the argument continuing. Mom's pleas for reconsideration, Dad's stubborn refusal. She needs to learn that the world doesn't revolve around her, he said. Besides, we can use her room for Mateo's training equipment. That corner could fit a pitching machine. They were already planning how to use my space before I was even gone. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of frantic planning. I called everyone I could think of, friends, distant relatives, even teachers, looking for temporary housing. Most were sympathetic, but couldn't help. Finally, Ms. Patel connected me with her niece, Priya, who was looking for a roommate in a city about 30 miles away. "It's not much," Priya warned when I called her. "Just a small 2-bedroom in a not-great neighborhood. But the rent's cheap, and I'm rarely home because of my hospital shifts." "I'll take it," I said immediately. "I can commute to my job until I leave for college." The night before I moved out, I sat in my room surrounded by boxes and trash bags, filled with my possessions. It was surprising how little I actually owned that mattered to me. Some clothes, my laptop, a few books, and the small collection of coding awards I'd kept hidden in my closet. There was a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find Mateo standing there, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Can I come in?" he asked. I shrugged and stepped aside. He entered hesitantly, looking around at the half-empty room. "So you're really leaving," he said. "Not like, I have a choice," he flinched. "I'm sorry, Soph. I didn't want this to happen." "But you didn't do anything to stop it either." He sat on my now bare mattress. "What could I do? I'm just a kid." "You could have said something. Anything. Instead of just sitting there while Dad kicked me out." Would it have made a difference? We both knew the answer to that. Once Dad made up his mind, it was set in concrete. "I brought you something," Mateo said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a cheap pendant, a little silver computer with a small blue stone for a screen. It was the kind of thing you'd find at a mall kiosk, not particularly valuable, but surprisingly thoughtful. "I bought it with my allowance," he said. "I thought, I don't know, that you should have something to remind you that not everyone thinks your computer stuff is stupid." I felt tears prick my eyes as I put it on. "Thanks, Mateo," he hugged me awkwardly. "I'll miss you too, buddy." The next morning, I loaded my belongings into my ancient Honda Civic, a 16th birthday present that had been more necessity than gift since I was expected to drive Mateo to his practices. Mom cried as she helped me carry boxes to the car, but she didn't ask me to stay. Dad watched from the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Call when you get settled," Mom said, hugging me tightly. "Sure," I replied, knowing I wouldn't. Dad approached as I was about to get in the car. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might ask me to reconsider leaving. Instead, he handed me an envelope. "Your birth certificate and social security. Card," he said stiffly. "You'll need them for college paperwork." That was it. No goodbye, no good luck, no acknowledgement that he was sending his 18-year-old daughter into the world alone. I got into my car and drove away without looking back, the cheap computer pendant weighing heavily against my chest. I had no idea what the future held, only that whatever success I achieved would be entirely my own. What I didn't know then was that my family's rejection would become the fuel for my determination. I couldn't have imagined that less than 10 years later, they'd be standing at my door, suitcases in hand, looking up at a house they could never have afforded in their wildest dreams. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I had to learn how to survive on my own. The first night in Priya's apartment, I sat on a borrowed air mattress surrounded by my hastily packed belongings and cried until I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just about being kicked out. It was the realization that my family had never seen me. Not really. That hurt more than sleeping on a deflating mattress in a strange apartment with paper-thin walls and mysterious stains on the ceiling. Priya was a godsend. A third-year nursing student working night shifts to pay her way through school, she was rarely home at the same time I was. But she left encouraging sticky notes on the fridge and shared her groceries without hesitation. First-generation college. Students have to stick together, she told me during our rare overlapping hours. Her parents had wanted her to get married after high school, not pursue a career. "They still love me," she said with a shrug. "But they don't understand my choices." My summer was a blur of exhaustion. I kept my cashier job at the Oakridge grocery store, commuting the 30 miles each way to maintain some financial stability. I also picked up a weekend job at a computer repair shop in our new neighborhood. It paid less than the grocery store, but gave me valuable experience with hardware that complemented my software skills. Between the two jobs, I was working nearly, 70 hours a week, stealing moments to sleep and prepare for college. Mom called once a week, her voice always tinged with a strange mix of guilt and resentment. "Your father might come around eventually," she'd say unconvincingly. "Mateo misses you." I'd ask about their lives, listen to updates about Mateo's baseball season, and hang up feeling hollow. Mateo texted occasionally, memes, random questions about laundry or cooking, never mentioning the elephant in the room. I responded with sisterly advice, keeping things light. What else could I do? He was still a kid caught in the middle. July came faster than expected, bringing with it the reality of college tuition bills. Despite my scholarship, there was still a significant gap that my summer savings couldn't completely bridge. I sat at our wobbly kitchen table, calculator in hand, fighting back panic as I juggled numbers. "You look like you're contemplating selling a kidney," Priya commented, dropping her backpack by the door after a 12-hour shift. I showed her my calculations. "I'm about $3,000 short for first semester, even with maxing out. Federal loans." Priya poured herself a glass of water, eyeing my spreadsheet. "Have you tried private scholarships? There are tons for women in tech. Most deadlines were months ago. What about that professor from your coding camp? The one who offered to help? Dr. Rivera." I'd nearly forgotten her offer in the chaos of the past few months. With nothing to lose, I composed an email that night, explaining my situation and asking if she knew of any last-minute scholarship opportunities or emergency student funds. Her response came the next morning, not with scholarship information, but something unexpected. "Sophia, I'm sorry to hear about your situation. While most scholarships have closed for this cycle, I have a different opportunity that might interest you. My former student has launched a tech startup developing inventory management software for small businesses, similar to your project from camp. They're looking for a part-time coder who can work remotely during the school year. The pay is modest, but would help with your expenses, and more importantly, it would give you real-world experience that would be valuable on your resume. If you're interested, send me your resume and I'll pass it along. Dr. Rivera." I nearly fell off my chair. This wasn't charity. It was a genuine opportunity based on my skills. I stayed up all night polishing my resume, detailing the projects I'd completed and the languages I'd mastered. 2 days and 1 video interview later, I had the job. VentureTrack wasn't a glamorous startup. Just 4 people working on inventory software for businesses too small to afford enterprise solutions. But they offered flexible hours and didn't care that I was a freshman as long as I could code. The founder, Jesse Kim, had dropped out of MIT in his junior year to launch the company. "School's great for fundamentals," he told me during our video call, "but nothing beats learning on the job." By the time move-in day arrived at Westfield, tech, I had cobbled together enough from my summer jobs, the VentureTrack position, and a last-minute emergency grant from the computer science department to cover first semester costs. Still, I arrived on campus with exactly $127 to my name and a mounting anxiety about how I'd cover the spring semester. The Westfield campus was intimidating, all gleaming glass buildings and students who seemed to know exactly where they were going. My roommate, Vanessa, arrived with her parents, who helped her unpack coordinated bedding sets and brand new electronics. I unpacked my thrift store comforter and secondhand laptop alone, ignoring the pitying glances from Vanessa's mother. "No. One coming to help you settle in?" she asked as she arranged Vanessa's desk supplies. "They couldn't make it," I said, the lie easier than explaining that my family had essentially disowned me for pursuing this opportunity. The first weeks of college were a special kind of hell. While other freshmen were exploring campus, attending mixers and figuring out their new freedom, I was juggling a full course load with 20 hours of remote work for VentureTrack. I lived on ramen and free event pizza, calculated the cost per wear of every item of clothing, and developed an encyclopedic knowledge of campus resources, free tutoring, tech lab hours where I could use high-end computers instead of my struggling, laptop, professors with open-door policies who didn't mind if I worked on problem sets in their offices to save on heating in my dorm. Vanessa and I developed a strange, distant friendship. She came from money. Her father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, but she wasn't unkind, just oblivious to her privilege. She invited me to parties I couldn't attend because of work deadlines and offered to loan me designer clothes I'd never feel comfortable wearing. When midterms rolled around and she noticed me pulling all-nighters to balance coursework with coding projects, she sat on my bed and asked point-blank, "Are you, okay, financially?" I nearly lied again, pride rising like a shield, but exhaustion won out. "Not really," I admitted. "My family doesn't support me being here, so I'm on my own." To my surprise, Vanessa didn't offer pity or charity. Instead, she said, "My cousin runs a tech tutoring service for rich old people who can't figure out their iPhones. It pays well, and you'd be way better at it than me. Want me to put in a good word?" That reference led to my third job. Tech. Concierge for wealthy retirees in the upscale communities surrounding campus. I'd make house calls to set up smart TVs, fix Wi-Fi issues, and teach basic computer skills to people who paid me more per hour than I made in half a day at the grocery store. The flexible schedule allowed me to fit appointments around classes, and the networking proved invaluable. One satisfied client referred me to her son, who needed help with his small accounting firm's network, which led to a recurring contract that finally allowed me to quit the grocery store job. As fall turned to winter, I settled into a grueling but sustainable routine. Weekdays were for classes and VentureTrack work. Evenings and weekends were split between tech concierge appointments, studying, and the occasional social event when I could justify the time. I avoided going home for Thanksgiving, picking up extra work hours instead. The money I saved on bus fare went toward a small care package for Mateo, a new baseball glove I found at a consignment shop and couldn't resist. I didn't return to Oakridge for Christmas either, despite Mom's half-hearted invitation. "Your father's calmed down," she claimed, though he hadn't spoken to me directly since I left. Instead, I accepted Vanessa's invitation to join her family at their lake house. It was an uncomfortable few days of pretending I wasn't overwhelmed by their casual wealth, but better than facing my parents' lingering disappointment. By spring semester, VentureTrack was gaining momentum. Jesse offered me more hours and a small raise after I developed a mobile integration that clients loved. Between that and my tech concierge work, I could breathe a little easier financially, though I was still working nearly 40 hours a week, on top of classes. One evening, as I hunched over my laptop in the library trying to debug a particularly frustrating piece of code, someone set a coffee cup next to my keyboard. I looked up to find Professor Chen, my algorithms instructor, watching me with concern. "You look like you could use this," he said, pulling up a chair. "And maybe a break." I thanked him for the coffee, expecting him to leave, but he stayed, asking pointed questions about the code on my screen. Before I knew it, we were deep in conversation about efficient search algorithms and database optimization. It was the most intellectually stimulating discussion I'd had in months. No client requirements, no grade pressure, just pure problem solving. As we wrapped up, Professor Chen studied me thoughtfully. "You know, the department has research assistant positions for undergrads. The pay isn't spectacular, but the work is more aligned with your studies than whatever side hustles you're juggling." My cheeks burned. "Is it that obvious? You're the only freshman in my advanced algorithms class, and you're acing it despite the dark circles under your eyes that suggest you're sleeping about 4 hours a night. Either you're superhuman or you're working too much outside of school." The research position changed everything. The work was challenging, helping Professor Chen develop algorithms for medical image processing, but directly relevant to my coursework. The steady campus job qualified me for work-study benefits and opened doors to academic opportunities I hadn't known existed. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I might actually belong in this world. Summer approached with a new dilemma. I couldn't afford to stay in the dorms during break, but I had no home to return to. The thought of subletting some stranger's apartment and working full-time just to cover expenses was depressing. Then Jesse from VentureTrack called with an unexpected proposition. "We just closed a round of seed funding," he said, excitement evident even over the phone. "We're expanding the team and moving operations to Chicago. I'd like to offer you a summer internship. Paid, of course, plus housing." I almost dropped the phone. "You want me to come to Chicago? You're one of our most reliable developers, even working part-time. Imagine what you could do with full focus." He paused. "I know. You're planning to finish your degree, and you should. But this could be valuable experience. And frankly, we need your brain on this project." The summer in Chicago was transformative. VentureTrack rented a 3-bedroom apartment for the interns, a massive upgrade from my dorm room. I worked harder than ever, but for the first time, I was fully immersed in tech culture, hackathons, meetups, networking events with other startups. I soaked up knowledge like a sponge, not just about coding, but about business models, venture capital, and the startup ecosystem. Jesse became something of a mentor, taking time to explain his decisions and including me in meetings with investors. "You have good instincts," he told me after I suggested a feature that a major client later praised. "Not just for code, but for the business side too." When August arrived and it was time to return to Westfield, Jesse made another offer. "Continue. Working remotely at increased hours and pay, with a small equity stake in the company. Consider it an investment in our future," he said. "And yours." I returned to campus for sophomore year with a transformed outlook. I still worked long hours, but now I was building something I partially owned. The research position with Professor Chen continued, expanding my academic network. For the first time, I bought new textbooks instead of used ones and didn't calculate the cost of every meal. Mom's calls grew less frequent as Mateo entered high school. His baseball career was progressing. He'd made varsity as a freshman, but his texts to me revealed a growing pressure from Dad that seemed painfully familiar. "He's talking about skipping college if I get drafted," one message read. "Says education is overrated if you have real talent." I tried to offer perspective without criticizing our parents. "Just keep your options open," I advised. "Baseball is great, but having a backup plan isn't a bad thing." Christmas of sophomore year, I finally returned to Oakridge, driven by a nagging worry about Mateo based on his increasingly terse messages. The visit was as awkward as expected. Dad was coldly polite, Mom fluttered nervously between us, and Mateo seemed withdrawn and tense. My old room had indeed been converted to a home. Jim focused on baseball training, so I slept on the couch. The most revealing moment came when Mom insisted on a family dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, clearly trying to manufacture normalcy. As we waited for our food, Dad interrogated me about my computer hobby. "I assume you'll be looking for a real job after graduation?" he asked. "Something stable?" Before I could answer, Mateo interjected. "She already has a real job, Dad. She's working for a tech startup while still in school. That's pretty impressive." Dad frowned. "Startups fail all the time. No security in that." "VentureTrack is doing well, actually," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "We just secured another round of funding and doubled our client base." "We?" Dad raised an eyebrow. "You're just a part-time coder." "I have equity in the company," I explained, then immediately regretted it when Dad's expression darkened. "Equity?" he scoffed. "Fancy word for IOUs from people trying to avoid paying real wages." "Dad," Mateo warned, "can we not do this?" The conversation shifted to safer ground. Mateo's baseball stats, Mom's new position at the factory, local gossip. But the moment had revealed the unchanging dynamics. My accomplishments would never be real to my father. Mateo's growing discontent would never be acknowledged. After dinner, Mateo and I escaped for a walk around the neighborhood. Under a streetlight, he confessed what I'd suspected. "I don't know if I want to play baseball in college, Soph. I like it, but not enough to make it my whole life." "Have you told Dad?" He kicked at a pile of snow. "Tried once. He said I was being ungrateful after all they've invested in my training. The parallels were so stark it hurt. What do you want to do instead?" "I'm good at physics. I like understanding how things work." He looked up at the night sky. "I thought maybe engineering, or something." We talked for hours that night, plotting how he could build a backup plan without triggering Dad's disapproval. I helped him research engineering programs with baseball scholarships, suggested dual-path approaches, and promised to help with applications when the time came. Before I left to return to school, I slipped him a new smartphone, not the latest model, but newer than his current one. "Password is my birthday," I told him. "I've set up an email account Dad doesn't know about and bookmarked some resources for college planning. You're not alone in this, okay?" The hug he gave me was fierce and desperate. For the first time, I understood that my struggle and success might create a path for him too. Back at Westfield, I threw myself into my expanding responsibilities. Junior year brought new challenges, more advanced coursework, leadership roles in research projects, and growing responsibilities at VentureTrack as we prepared to launch a major product update. I was exhausted but fulfilled, finally seeing the results of my relentless work. Spring semester, everything accelerated. VentureTrack's new platform gained traction faster than expected, creating a cascade of opportunities and challenges. I found myself flying to Chicago monthly for all hands, meetings, juggling midterms with investor presentations. Professor Chen introduced me to colleagues at major tech companies, laying groundwork for post-graduation opportunities. Then came the call that would change everything. "We've been acquired," Jesse announced one Tuesday evening, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Datasphere just made an offer that's, Sophia, it's life-changing for all of us." Datasphere was a tech giant, known for enterprise solutions and deep pockets. The acquisition meant security for VentureTrack's product and team, and for equity holders like me, a sudden financial windfall that seemed surreal. "How life-changing?" I asked, barely able to form the words. Jesse named a figure that made me sink to the floor of my dorm room. It was more money than my parents would earn in 15 years at the factory. More than enough to finish college without working. More than enough to help Mateo, to buy a house, to build a life I'd never imagined possible. "There's more," Jesse continued. "They want to keep our team intact. That includes you. They're offering a position after graduation. Full benefits, competitive salary, relocation package." I ended the call in a daze. 3 years ago, I'd been kicked out of my childhood home for daring to pursue this path. Now that path had led to financial security beyond my wildest expectations, and a career launch most graduates would kill for. That night, sitting on my dorm room floor surrounded by textbooks and the remnants of a hastily eaten dinner, I allowed myself to cry. Not from exhaustion or stress, but from vindication. I had gambled everything on myself when no one else would, and against all odds, I had won. What I didn't know then, as I celebrated my sudden change in fortune, was that my family's situation was deteriorating just as dramatically in the opposite direction. I couldn't have predicted how our paths would collide again, or that the mansion I hadn't even dreamed of owning yet would become the backdrop for the most unexpected family reunion imaginable. The acquisition money hit my bank account on a Tuesday, morning during finals week of my junior year. I stared at my phone screen, the banking app displaying a balance with more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the device. Breathe, Sophia. This is real. My first action wasn't anything extravagant. I paid off my student loans, all of them, in one fell swoop. 3 years of accumulated debt, gone in a single transaction. The relief was so profound I sat on the floor of my dorm room and sobbed, the weight of constant financial anxiety lifting from my shoulders. My second move was more calculated. I called a financial advisor recommended by Jessie, setting up an appointment for the following week. "Don't do anything major until we talk," she cautioned. "Sudden wealth requires careful management." I followed her advice, making only one additional, significant transaction, a deposit into a separate account I'd created for Mateo's college fund, enough to cover 4 years at any university, plus living expenses. He was a junior in high school now, and based on our infrequent communications, increasingly at odds with our father over his future. By graduation day, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined. With my financial advisor's guidance, I had a diversified investment portfolio, a retirement account already substantial enough to ensure comfort in my old age, and a clear plan for my immediate future. Datasphere had honored the employment offer that came with the acquisition, providing me with a starting position as a senior developer at their headquarters in Seattle, with a salary that made my previous earnings look like pocket change. "You got lucky," one of my classmates commented when I mentioned my post-graduation plans. It stung, that dismissal of the years of sleepless nights, the constant hustle, the sacrifice of every normal college experience in pursuit of my goals. "Luck is when preparation meets opportunity," Professor Chen countered, having overheard the exchange. Sophia created her own luck through exceptional work. The validation from my mentor meant more than any windfall. 2 weeks after graduation, I flew to Seattle to find an apartment before starting my new position. The rental market was brutal. Tech money had driven prices to astronomical levels, and even with my new resources, I was shocked by what constituted luxury living in the city. After viewing a dozen soulless high-rises with identical granite countertops and zero character, I found myself at an open house for a different type of property entirely, a restored Victorian in Queen Anne Hill, with bay windows, ornate woodwork, and a view of the Space Needle from the upper floors. It was being sold by an elderly professor, moving to a retirement community, the realtor explained, showing me through rooms filled with built-in bookshelves and unexpected nooks. "This is a house for someone who appreciates history," the agent remarked as I ran my hand along a banister worn smooth by generations of touch. "How much?" I asked, already knowing it was far beyond what I'd planned to spend on housing. The figure she named was staggering, more than double my budget. Yet standing in the kitchen with morning light streaming through stained glass accents, I could envision a life here, not just existing in a sterile apartment, but building a real home. My financial advisor nearly had a heart attack when I called her. "Real estate can be a good investment," she acknowledged, "but this is significantly more than we discussed for housing." "It's not just housing," I tried to explain. "It's permanence. Something I'd never had. Something that had been stripped away when my family rejected me. In the end, we compromised. I would make a larger down payment to keep the mortgage manageable, and I would rent out the garden apartment on the lower level to offset costs. It was still financially aggressive, but not reckless. The day I signed the papers, becoming the owner of a 5-bedroom Victorian that the previous owner's family had occupied for 3 generations, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and imposter syndrome. Who was I to own such a place? A factory worker's daughter from a small town, barely a year past surviving on ramen and free event pizza. Yet there I was, clutching keys to a house larger than I needed, with a view that took my breath away and wood floors that creaked with history. I sent a single photo to Mateo, just the exterior, with the caption, "My new place in Seattle. You'll always have a room here." His response came hours later. Holy shit, Soph. Living the dream. If only he knew how complicated that dream felt. My first months at Datasphere were a whirlwind of new challenges. The scale of operations dwarfed anything at VentureTrack. Thousands of employees, millions of users, codebases so vast that entire teams managed just fragments of functionality. I was assigned to integrate VentureTrack's technology into their enterprise platform, essentially scaling what we'd built for small businesses to serve multinational corporations. The work was fascinating and all-consuming. I dove in headfirst, establishing myself as someone who could bridge the gap between startup agility and corporate robustness. My immediate supervisor, Diane, became a valuable mentor, teaching me to navigate the politics of a large organization while maintaining the innovative spirit that had made our smaller company attractive to them. "You have rare instincts," she told me during my first performance review. "Most technical people either can't see the business implications or don't care. You connect those dots naturally." Home life developed its own rhythm. I filled the house, gradually haunting estate sales and antique shops for pieces that complemented its character. The garden apartment went to Maya, a medical resident who worked such brutal hours that we rarely crossed paths, making her the perfect tenant. I converted the third floor into a home office with views that made video conferences a talking point with colleagues. Weekends were for exploration, hiking the surrounding mountains, discovering neighborhood cafes, attending tech meetups where I could build my local network. I was building a life that was entirely mine, shaped by my choices rather than family expectations or financial constraints. It was around the 6-month mark in Seattle when the first concerning call from Mateo came. I was preparing for a presentation when his name flashed on my screen. "Dad's being impossible," he said without preamble. "He's talking to some scout who says I could get drafted out of high school if I focus exclusively on training senior year." My stomach tightened. What does that mean exactly? "He wants me to drop AP Physics and Computer Science to free up time for more intensive training. Says academics don't matter if I'm going pro." I set down my coffee, suddenly alert. "And what do you want?" A long silence. "I don't think I want to play baseball professionally, Soph. I'm good, but not MLB good, no matter what Dad thinks. And I actually like physics. I might want to do engineering like we talked about." "Have you told him that?" Mateo's bitter laugh said everything. "Tried. He said I was throwing away my one shot at being extraordinary to be mediocre at something else." The cruelty of those words, so similar to what had been implied about my own choices, made my blood boil. "You're not mediocre at anything, Mateo." "Try telling Dad that." He paused. "Mom's no help either. She just keeps saying I should consider what makes Dad happy." After we hung up, I paced my office, fighting the urge to call my father and unleash years of accumulated resentment. Instead, I channeled that energy into action, emailing Mateo links to engineering programs with information about application requirements. "Don't drop those AP classes," I wrote. "They matter for admissions. And remember the account I set up? For you, college is covered. No baseball scholarship required." Over the next months, a pattern emerged. Mateo would call, increasingly frustrated with our parents' single-minded focus on his baseball career. I would offer support, resources, and occasional subversive advice on how to maintain his academic interests while appeasing Dad enough to avoid open rebellion. It was a delicate balance, one I recognized from my own teenage years. The truly concerning news came shortly after Mateo's graduation. He called during my morning coffee on the veranda, his voice tight with stress. "Dad lost his job," he said flatly. "The factory's closing, moving operations to Mexico. 300 people let go." Oh no. Despite everything, I felt genuine sympathy. Dad had worked at that factory for over 25 years. What about Mom? Different department, so she's still employed for now. But they're cutting back her hours, and there are rumors of more layoffs coming. He lowered his voice. "They're really struggling, Soph. The mortgage, My college deposits, even with your help. Dad's looking for work, but there's not much here. For someone his age with factory skills. I closed my eyes, processing. How are you holding up? Stressed. Dad's drinking more. Keeps talking about how I'm their safety net, how going pro is more important than ever. A deep breath. I got into Cornell Engineering, South, full academic scholarship. Mateo, that's amazing. Yeah, well, Dad thinks it's a waste of my talent. The bitterness in his voice was familiar. He actually said, and I quote, "Your sister chased her pipe dreams, and now look at our situation." The unfairness of it stung. Dad was blaming my career choice for his job loss? The mental gymnastics required for that connection were Olympic level. Take the Cornell offer, I said firmly. It's a full ride at an Ivy League school. That's not something you turn down, especially not for a long-shot baseball career. I know. I'm going. His voice strengthened. I already accepted. Dad's barely speaking to me. He'll get over it, I said, with more confidence than I felt. Focus on your future. But the situation at home deteriorated further. Over the summer, Mateo's calls became increasingly alarming. Dad had been unable to find comparable work, taking instead a part-time position at a hardware store for less than half his previous salary. Mom's hours had been cut again. They were falling behind on the mortgage, arguing constantly about money. They're talking about selling the house, Mateo reported in August, days before he was set to leave for Cornell. But the market's terrible here since the factory closed. Every laid-off worker is trying to sell simultaneously. I felt a twist of guilt, sitting in my beautiful home while my parents faced possible foreclosure. Despite everything, they were still my family. Do they need help? I asked reluctantly. Dad would never take money from you, Mateo said bluntly. You know that. His pride wouldn't allow it. He was right, of course. The same pride that had driven Dad to kick me out rather than support my education would prevent him from accepting financial help, no matter how desperately needed. When Mateo left for Cornell, the situation worsened. Without him at home to mediate tensions and provide updates, my knowledge of my parents' circumstances became spotty. Mom's calls grew less frequent and more strained. Reading between the lines, I gathered things were dire, but not yet catastrophic. Meanwhile, my own career was accelerating. My work integrating VentureTrack's technology had impressed DataSphere's leadership, earning me a promotion to project manager overseeing a team of developers. The additional responsibilities came with a substantial raise and more equity in the company. As autumn turned to winter, I settled into the rhythm of my new role, the demands of leadership leaving little time to dwell on my family's troubles. The Victorian was finally fully furnished, each room reflecting my evolving taste, a blend of modern technology and traditional craftsmanship that felt uniquely mine. For Christmas, I invited Mateo to Seattle rather than having him return to the tension at home. He arrived looking exhausted but excited, babbling about his engineering courses and the robotics club he'd joined. We spent the holiday exploring the city, hiking snowy trails, and relaxing by the fireplace in what he called my mansion of a house. It's not a mansion, I protested. It's just a well-preserved Victorian. It's got more bathrooms than people, he countered. By Oakridge standards, that's a mansion. On his last night in Seattle, as we shared a bottle of wine, his first legal drinks at 18 with his cool older sister, he joked, Mateo finally opened up about the full situation at home. They're 3 months behind on the mortgage, he said, staring into his glass. Foreclosure notices have started. Dad's pride is the only thing keeping them from bankruptcy. I set down my glass. Why didn't you tell me sooner? What could you do that wouldn't make it worse? Dad's already bitter about your success. If you swooped in with financial help, he'd just resent you more. So they're just going to lose the house? Where will they go? Mateo shrugged helplessly. Mom mentioned her sister in Florida might have room temporarily. It's all falling apart, Soph. That night, after Mateo went to bed, I sat in my home office overlooking the twinkling lights of Seattle and made a decision that would alter all our lives. I contacted a real estate attorney to explore options for purchasing my parents' home discreetly, potentially through a holding company that wouldn't immediately reveal my involvement. If I could buy the property and allow them to stay as tenants, with manageable rent, it might provide a solution that didn't trigger Dad's pride. The attorney advised caution. Family financial entanglements can get messy, she warned. Are you prepared for the potential fallout? I wasn't, not really. But the alternative, knowing my parents were homeless while I lived in comfort, seemed worse. Before I could implement this plan, however, events took an unexpected turn. Just after New Year's, I received a rare call from Mom. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. Sophia? I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been an accident. My heart stopped. Is it Mateo? No. It's your father. He fell at work. Scaffolding collapsed. He's in bad shape. Broken hip. Spinal issues. They're not sure if he'll walk normally again. I gripped the phone tighter. Oh my God. I'm so sorry, Mom. The medical bills? Her voice broke. We have some insurance. Through my job, but the deductible, the co-pays, the lost wages. We're losing the house, Sophia. The bank won't wait any longer. I closed my eyes, already knowing what was coming. I wouldn't ask. But we have nowhere to go. She was crying now. Your aunt's place in Florida fell through. Her husband lost his job, too. We're out of options. What are you asking, Mom? I needed her to say it directly. A deep breath. Is there any way we could stay with you? Just until Dad recovers enough to work again? We'd be no trouble. I promise. The irony was almost too perfect. The parents who had kicked me out for pursuing my dreams now needed shelter in the home those dreams had purchased. Part of me wanted to remind her of that night 5 years ago, when they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome under their roof if I chose education over family obligation. But the broken sound of my mother's voice stopped me. This wasn't about vindication. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be. How soon do you need to leave Oakridge? I asked, already mentally rearranging my home to accommodate 2 people I barely knew anymore. 2 weeks, she whispered. The foreclosure is final on the 15th. I'll book your flights, I said. The garden apartment has a separate entrance and is ADA accessible. It should work for Dad's recovery. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Gratitude, shame, regret, too complex to articulate. Thank you, Mom finally managed. After we hung up, I sat motionless, watching the winter sunset paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and pink. My parents were coming to live in my mansion, as Mateo called it. The same parents who hadn't believed in me, who had chosen another child's potential over my proven abilities, who had made me feel invisible in my own home for 18 years. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt strangely hollow, already dreading the complicated emotions their presence would bring. This wouldn't be a simple case of helping family in need. It would be a reckoning with our shared past and the vastly different paths we'd taken since that painful separation. What I couldn't have anticipated was how their arrival would force us all to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years, or how the Victorian that had become my sanctuary would become the stage for our most difficult reckonings. The house wasn't just a symbol of my success anymore. It was about to become the crucible in which our broken family relationships would either be reforged or destroyed beyond repair. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. I cleared out the garden apartment where Maya had been living, finding her alternative housing in a colleague's duplex nearby. I hired contractors to install grab bars and a walk-in shower for Dad's recovery needs. I stocked the kitchenette with familiar brands I remembered from childhood, an olive branch of sorts. Throughout it all, a single question echoed in my mind. Was I welcoming my parents out of compassion, obligation, or some deep-seated desire to prove their judgment wrong? The answer remained elusive, my motivations as complex and layered as the relationship that had shaped and scarred me. The day before their scheduled arrival, I stood in the newly prepared apartment, surveying my work. The space was comfortable, practical, and completely separate from my living areas upstairs. A physical boundary I knew we would all need as we navigated this new chapter. On the kitchen counter, I'd left a spare key and a welcome note that had taken me 7 drafts to write, settling finally on simple truth. This home is your safe harbor for as long as you need it. We'll figure out the rest as we go. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Mateo. You're a better person than I would be. Call if you need reinforcements. I smiled despite my anxiety. Whatever happened next, I wasn't alone anymore. I had built my own support system, my own definition of family. That night, I barely slept, imagining the moment my parents would see the life I'd built, the success they had never believed possible, the stability they had never thought I could achieve on my impractical path. Would there be recognition in their eyes, regret? Or would Dad's pride still blind him to the evidence before him? Morning came with fog shrouding the Seattle skyline, the Space Needle appearing and disappearing like some mythical tower. As I sipped coffee on my veranda, watching the mist swirl around the city below, I felt strangely calm. Whatever came next, I was ready. I had overcome far worse than an awkward family reunion. The car service I'd arranged texted that they were 20 minutes away. I took a deep breath, straightening my shoulders as I prepared to welcome my past into my present, not as the desperate, rejected daughter I had once been, but as the successful, self-made woman I had become despite everything. The doorbell rang, and I descended the stairs to answer it, each step bringing me closer to a confrontation 5 years in the making. As I reached for the handle, I reminded myself of an essential truth. I had nothing left to prove, not to them, not to anyone. My success spoke for itself. Now it was time to see if we could build something new from the ashes of what we'd lost. I opened the door to find my parents standing on my porch, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Dad leaned heavily on a walker, his proud posture broken by injury and circumstance. Mom clutched a single suitcase, her knuckles white with tension. Their faces registered shock as they took in the Grand Victorian and the daughter they barely recognized standing confidently in its doorway. "Welcome to Seattle," I said simply, stepping back to let them in. That first evening with my parents in my home was like a surreal play where everyone had forgotten their lines. Mom fluttered around the garden apartment, exclaiming over the lovely details with forced brightness, while Dad sat silently in an armchair, staring at nothing. I maintained a polite distance, showing them how to work the appliances and where to find essentials, careful to keep the conversation light. "There's a hospital bed coming tomorrow," I explained, handing Mom a folder of information. "The physical therapist will visit 3 times a week. Her card is in there. I've stocked the pantry with basics, but let me know if you need anything specific." It was all very civilized, very practical. None of us mentioned the past. None of us acknowledged the chasm between us or the twist of fate that had landed them in my home after they had pushed me from theirs. We were performers in a play about strangers who happened to share DNA. "This is very generous of you, Sophia," Mom said as I prepared to leave them to settle in. We're grateful." Dad grunted something that might have been agreement or might have been pain from his injuries. I couldn't tell, and I was too exhausted to decipher it. "Get some rest," I said. "We can talk more tomorrow." Upstairs in my own space, I poured a generous glass of wine and called Mateo. "They've landed," I told him, currently occupying the garden apartment looking shell-shocked and awkward. "That tracks," he said, How's Dad handling it? Hard to tell. He's barely spoken. Probably killing him to be dependent on his disappointing daughter. Mateo sighed. Give it time. His pride took a bigger hit than his hip. The first week established a strained routine. Mom would text rather than knock if they needed anything, and I responded promptly but maintained my distance. Dad's physical therapy consumed most of their energy and attention, giving us all a convenient focus that wasn't our fractured relationship. I worked longer hours than usual, grateful for the demanding projects that kept me at the office and out of the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere at home. My colleagues noticed. Everything okay? Diane asked after I volunteered for yet another late meeting. You've been practically living here lately. Family stuff, I said vaguely. My parents are staying with me temporarily. Her eyebrows rose. I didn't know you were close with your family. We're not, I admitted. That's kind of the problem. The dam broke on Sunday evening, 10 days after their arrival. I'd been avoiding family dinners, but Mom's increasingly plaintive texts made me feel guilty. We hardly see you, she wrote. Please join us for dinner? I'm making your favorite. Pasta from when you were little. I reluctantly agreed, bringing a bottle of wine down to the garden apartment. Mom had transformed the small dining area, setting the table with care and serving her signature dish. Pasta primavera with extra. Mushrooms just as I'd loved as a child. The domesticity of it felt like a time warp. For 20 minutes, we maintained the charade of normalcy, discussing Seattle weather, Dad's physical therapy progress, and neutral topics from the news. Then Mom, perhaps emboldened by wine, ventured into dangerous territory. Your house is beautiful, Sophia. You've done so well for yourself. Better than we ever. She trailed off, realizing too late where her words were leading. Better than you ever expected? I finished for her. Better than you thought possible when you decided my education wasn't worth supporting. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Here we go, he muttered. Diego, Mom warned. No, let's have this out, I said, setting down my wine glass. We've been dancing around it for days. You're living in my home because you have nowhere else to go. The same daughter you threw away when she needed you is now your safety net. Don't you find that just a little bit ironic? Dad's face flushed. You think we wanted this? To be charity cases for our know-it-all daughter? Diego, please, Mom pleaded. No, Elena. She wants to gloat? Let her gloat. He fixed me with a hard stare. Yes, you were right. Your computer games turned out to be lucrative. You got lucky. That doesn't change the fact that you abandoned your family when we needed you. The unfairness of it stole my breath. I abandoned you? You kicked me out. You chose Mateo's baseball over my future. We chose what was best for the family, he shot back. One of our children had a real chance at success. We invested accordingly. And you were wrong, I said quietly. You were completely, catastrophically wrong. Mateo is brilliant at physics and engineering, not just baseball. He's at Cornell on an academic scholarship right now, did you know that? And me? Those computer games you dismissed built technology that powers multinational corporations. We both could have succeeded if you'd supported us both. Mom was crying, silently now, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. What do you want from us, Sophia? Dad demanded. An apology? Fine. I'm sorry we couldn't afford to send both our children to fancy colleges. I'm sorry we had to make hard choices. That's not what this is about, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. You didn't believe in me. You never saw me. And when I needed you most, you chose to throw me away rather than reconsider your narrow vision of success. The silence that followed was deafening. I think I'm tired, Dad finally said, reaching for his walker. Thank you for dinner. He disappeared into the bedroom, leaving Mom and me with the ruins of our family dinner. She began clearing plates with shaking hands. He doesn't mean to be harsh, she said softly. He's in constant pain, and his pride. "Don't make excuses for him, Mom. Not anymore." She set down the stack of plates and faced me directly for perhaps the first time since their arrival. "What do you want from us, Sophia?" "Really?" I considered. The question. What did I want? Vindication? I already had that. Revenge? That felt hollow. An apology? Dad's grudging words had demonstrated how meaningless that would be. "I want you to see me," I said finally. "Not as your meal ticket or your landlord or even your successful daughter. Just me. The person I've always been. The person you never took the time to know." She nodded slowly. "I'd like that chance," she whispered. "If you're willing to give it." That conversation marked a turning point. Not a miraculous healing, those only happen in movies, but a shift in how we occupied the same space. Mom began making genuine efforts to understand my work, asking questions about my projects and listening attentively to my explanations. I started joining them for coffee once or twice a week, gradually sharing stories from my college years and early career. Dad remained more distant, but his hostility diminished. One evening, I found him examining the home office I'd set up in a corner of the main house's living room. "You've got quite a setup here," he said, gesturing to the multiple monitors and specialized equipment. "It's for when I work from home," I explained, bracing for a dismissive comment. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Mateo mentioned you helped design some kind of inventory system for businesses?" The question, so unexpected, momentarily left me speechless. "Yes," I managed. "That was my project at Venture Track. We created software that helps small businesses track inventory and predict ordering needs." Huh. He seemed to be turning this over in his mind, like what they had at the factory, but for smaller operations? Similar concept, yes, but more accessible and user-friendly. He nodded again, then said something that floored me. "That's pretty impressive, actually." The compliment was awkward, grudging even, but it was possibly the first time my father had acknowledged my work as valuable. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply thanked him, and we left it at that. But something had shifted, a tiny crack in the wall between us. As weeks turned into months, my parents gradually became more integrated into my life. Mom discovered a talent for gardening, transforming the Victorians' neglected backyard into a thriving oasis. Dad, once his physical therapy progressed to the point where he could move more freely, took an interest in the house's historical features, researching its original details and even beginning some minor restoration work on the ornate woodwork. It wasn't perfect. We still had arguments, some explosive, reopening old wounds, but they were interspersed with moments of genuine connection that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The most significant breakthrough came unexpectedly during a video call with Mateo. He'd been checking in regularly, anxious about how our forced cohabitation was progressing. This particular Sunday, Mom and Dad happened to be in my living room when the call came through. "Family meeting?" Mateo joked when he saw all three of us on screen. What followed was our first genuine conversation as a complete family in years. Mateo shared his experiences at Cornell, his excitement about a robotics competition, his struggle with calculus. For once, Dad listened without interjecting comments about baseball or wasted potential. "I'm thinking about summer internships," Mateo said. "There's one at a medical device company that sounds amazing." "That's great, son," Dad said, surprising us all. "You always were good at figuring out how things work." The simple acknowledgement of Mateo's natural abilities, beyond baseball, left my brother momentarily speechless. "Thanks, Dad," he finally managed. Later, after the call ended, I found Dad on the veranda, staring out at the Seattle skyline. "That was new," I commented, leaning against the railing beside him. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I've had a lot of time to think, lying, in that hospital bed, then stuck in the apartment, about the factory, about baseball, about choices." I waited, sensing he had more to say. All those years at the factory, following orders, playing it safe. That was all I knew. All I thought was possible for people like us. He glanced at me sideways. Then you went and rewrote the rules. I just followed my interests, I said. Like you encouraged Mateo to do with baseball. He winced slightly. Pushed, not encouraged. There's a difference. He sighed heavily. I was afraid, Sophia. Afraid you'd end up struggling like your mother. And me. Afraid you'd blame us for not steering you toward something secure. I never wanted security if it meant giving up fulfillment, I said quietly. I'm beginning to understand that. He turned to face me fully. I was wrong. About a lot of things. I'm not good at saying this, but I'm proud of what you've built. Not just this house or your job, but your life. Your resilience. The admission, so long awaited and now so freely given, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. It wasn't a full accounting for the pain of the past, but it was a genuine acknowledgement of my journey. For now, that was enough. As spring turned to summer, we found a new equilibrium. Dad's health improved enough for him to take a part-time position as a consultant for a local hardware store, advising on their inventory systems. Mom found work at a garden center, her newfound passion translating into a job she genuinely enjoyed. They began talking about finding their own place, though the Seattle market made that a daunting prospect. No rush, I told them, surprising myself with how much I meant it. This place is too big for just me anyway. Mateo came for summer break, completing our improbable family reunion. Watching him discuss engineering concepts with Dad, who now asked genuine questions instead of dismissing them as impractical, I felt a sense of wonder at how far we'd come. The night before Mateo was due to return to Cornell, we sat together, on the back deck, the four of us sharing wine under strings of lights Mom had hung from the pergola. If someone had told me a year ago we'd be sitting here like this, I'd have said they were crazy, Mateo mused. Dad chuckled. Life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. Mom raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said softly. We clinked glasses under the Seattle stars, a family broken and rebuilt, different but somehow stronger at the repaired fractures. The mansion that had once been a symbol of my solo success had become something else entirely, a place of reckoning, reconciliation, and unexpected second chances. The journey wasn't over. We still had difficult conversations ahead, old habits to unlearn, new boundaries to establish. But for the first time since I'd been driven from my childhood home, I felt the possibility of something I'd stopped believing in. That family could be both chosen and born, broken and mended, lost and, against all odds, found again. 2 years after my parents moved into the garden apartment, Seattle hosted a major tech conference that attracted industry leaders from around the world. Datasphere selected me to present our newest enterprise solution, a platform that incorporated and expanded the inventory management system I'd first designed as a college student. Standing on that stage, explaining complex technological concepts to a packed auditorium, I felt a surreal sense of arrival. This was the future I'd fought for, risked everything for. What made the moment truly extraordinary was looking out to see my family sitting in the third row. Mom beaming with genuine pride, Dad listening intently with newfound respect, and Mateo, home from his junior year at Cornell, giving me a subtle thumbs up when I nailed a particularly technical explanation. After the presentation, as attendees, networked over cocktails, a venture capitalist approached me. Impressive work, he said, handing me his card. I'd love to discuss your vision for where this technology could go next. She's got plenty of vision, my father interjected, suddenly appearing at my side. Been innovating since she was a teenager. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. Later that night, as we celebrated over dinner at Seattle's best seafood restaurant, Mateo raised his glass. To Sophia, Tech genius and official family success story. I laughed, but Dad shook his head. Not the only success story, he corrected, nodding at Mateo. That engineering internship at Boston Medical Technologies is pretty impressive too. The ease with which he acknowledged both his children's accomplishments, so different from the favoritism that had dominated our childhood, still took me by surprise sometimes. Speaking of success stories, Mom added, we have some news. She glanced at Dad, who nodded encouragingly. We've found a place of our own, she continued. A small condo near the garden center. Nothing fancy, but... It's ours, Dad finished. Or it will be once the paperwork goes through. Down payment's already approved. I blinked in surprise. They'd been saving for months, I knew, but hadn't realized they were this close to moving out. A complex mix of emotions washed over me. Pride in their independence, a twinge of sadness at the coming change, relief at the restoration of my complete privacy. That's fantastic, I said, meaning it. Though you know you're welcome to stay as long as you need. It's time, Dad said simply. We've imposed on you long enough. It hasn't been. I started to protest, but stopped at his raised eyebrow. We both knew there had been plenty of difficult moments in our cohabitation, despite the progress we'd made. Besides, Mom added with a sly smile, we thought you might appreciate having your space back, especially with Alex coming around more often. I felt my cheeks warm. Alex was a data scientist I'd been dating for the past 6 months. Brilliantly intelligent, unfailingly kind, and endearingly patient with my complicated family dynamics. Things were getting serious, conversations about the future becoming more concrete. Maybe, I admitted, ignoring Mateo's exaggerated wink. That evening marked a turning point. Not a dramatic rupture like my teenage exile, but a gentle transition toward a new phase of our family story. Over the next month, my parents gradually moved their belongings to their new condo, a modest but modern space that reflected their evolving tastes rather than desperate necessity. The day they officially moved out, I helped carry the last few boxes to their car. Dad paused before getting in, looking back at the Victorian that had been his unexpected home during the most humbling period of his life. Never thought I'd say this, he admitted, but I'm going to miss this place. You're welcome back anytime, I said, surprising myself again with how much I meant it. Sunday dinners, holidays, whenever. He nodded, eyes suspiciously bright. We'll take you up on that. As they drove away, I felt an unexpected lightness. The mansion was fully mine again, but it no longer represented the solitary refuge I'd first purchased. It had become something more complex, a space transformed by reconciliation, a backdrop to a family story still unfolding. Alex came over that evening, bringing takeout and a bottle of wine to celebrate what he called my empty nest. Transition. How does it feel? He asked as we settled on the veranda with our glasses. Having your castle back to yourself? I considered the question seriously. Quieter, a little emptier, but also right, somehow. Like we've all come full circle. They've come a long way, he observed. Especially your dad. This was true. Dad had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation, from the rigid patriarch who'd thrown me out to a man capable of acknowledging his mistakes and rebuilding relationships on more equal footing. His part-time consulting work had evolved into a small business advising local shops on inventory management, ironically using simplified versions of the systems I'd helped develop. We all have, I said. 5 years ago, I never would have believed we could have a healthy relationship. And now? Now we're figuring it out day by day. It's not perfect, but it's real. Alex nodded thoughtfully, then shifted the conversation in an unexpected direction. I've been thinking about the house. What about it? It's beautiful, historic, perfectly you. He set down his wine glass. But it's also a symbol of a specific phase of your life. The phase where you needed to prove something to yourself, to your family, to the world. I frowned slightly. What are you saying? I'm wondering if you've considered what comes next. What home means to you now that you're not that solitary girl with something to prove anymore? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the practical aspects of my parents moving out that I hadn't considered the symbolic implications. Was Alex right? Had the Victorian served its purpose in my journey? Before I could formulate a response, he reached into his pocket and placed a small box on the table between us. I'm not proposing, he said quickly, seeing my expression. Not exactly, but I am suggesting a partnership. He opened the box to reveal a simple silver key. I found a piece of land, on the peninsula overlooking the Sound. Beautiful location, nothing built yet. My breath caught. Alex, I'm not asking you to give up this place, but I am asking if you'd consider building something new, together. A home that's neither your past nor mine, but something we create as a team. I picked up the key, turning it over in my fingers. A blank slate. More like the next chapter, he corrected gently. Your story doesn't erase just because you turn the page. That night, after Alex left, I wandered through the Victorians' rooms, seeing them with new eyes. Every corner held memories now, not just of my solitary achievement, but of healing and growth. My parents arguing in the kitchen, then gradually learning to communicate again. Mateo sprawled on the living room floor during breaks, explaining his latest engineering project with infectious enthusiasm. Family dinners that evolved from tense standoffs to genuine conversations. I realized that Alex was right. The mansion had served its purpose, not just as a symbol of my success, but as the unlikely setting for our family's reconnection. Perhaps it was time to consider what came next. The following weekend, I drove out to see the land Alex had purchased. Standing on the bluff overlooking the water, wind whipping my hair, I could envision the possibilities. A modern home with walls of glass to capture the view. Space for Alex's music studio and my home office. Guest rooms for family visits. Room to grow. When I returned to the city, I called a family meeting at my parents' new condo. Over Mom's homemade lasagna, I shared Alex's proposal and my evolving thoughts. You're selling the Victorian? Mom asked, surprised. Considering it, I clarified. Nothing decided yet, but I wanted your input. Dad studied me carefully. This isn't about us moving out, is it? Making you reconsider the space? I smiled at his concern. No, it's more about recognizing that the house served its purpose. I bought it when I needed to prove something. To myself, maybe to you. But I'm not that person anymore. You thinking of building with Alex? Mateo asked perceptively. I nodded. He found land on the peninsula. It's beautiful. Peaceful. Sounds serious, Dad commented, but there was no judgment in his tone. It is, I acknowledged, but also exciting. A chance to build something that's forward-looking rather than defined by the past. Mom reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Then I think it's perfect. Over the next 6 months, life accelerated on multiple fronts. Alex and I got officially engaged, a quiet proposal on the peninsula land that would eventually hold our home. Mateo graduated early from Cornell and accepted a position with a robotics firm in Seattle, partly to be near family. My parents settled into their condo and community, Dad's consulting business growing steadily, while Mom became a fixture at the garden center. The Victorian went on the market and sold quickly to a young family with 3 children who loved its history and space. Watching them tour the house, children running excitedly from room to room, parents envisioning their future there, I felt a sense of rightness. The house would continue its story with new characters. Construction began on the peninsula property. Alex and I collaborating with an architect to design a home that reflected both our sensibilities, modern but warm, open to nature but offering cozy spaces for rainy Seattle days. On the day we broke ground, my entire family came to celebrate. Standing on the bare earth that would eventually support our home, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. "Penny for your thoughts," Dad said, joining me as I looked out over the water. "Just thinking about full circles," I replied. 10 years ago, you kicked me out because I wanted to pursue computer science. Now we're all standing here because that same path led to this moment." He winced slightly at the reminder, but nodded. "Life doesn't move in straight lines," he observed. "More like spirals. You come back around to similar places, but you're at a different level." The insight surprised me. Philosophical reflection wasn't Dad's usual style. "That's actually profound," I teased. He chuckled. "Even old dogs learn new tricks eventually." Mom called us over for the ceremonial first shovel turn, Alex's parents, joining our family in a circle around the marked foundation lines. As we each took turns with the silver shovel, I was struck by how naturally our formerly fractured family blended with Alex's. No awkwardness, no painful history visible to casual observers, just two families coming together to celebrate a new beginning. Later, as we shared champagne and watched the sunset paint the sound in brilliant orange and pink, Mateo sidled up beside me. "Remember when we were kids?" he asked quietly. "And you used to draw house plans in your school notebooks? Huge mansions, with turrets and swimming pools?" I laughed at the memory. Architectural aspirations I'd forgotten about, before computers captured my imagination. "You always said you'd have a big house one day, with room for everyone you loved." He nodded toward our family, mingling easily on the bluff. "Looks like you're making good on that, just not how little Sophia imagined." His observation stayed with me long after the celebration ended. My childhood dreams of a mansion had come, true in the Victorian, but its true value hadn't been in its grandeur or even in the vindication it represented. Its worth had been in the healing that happened within its walls, the broken family that had somehow found their way back to each other despite pride, hurt, and years of separation. Now, as I prepared to build a new home with Alex, I understood that the true meaning of home had nothing to do with square footage or impressive architecture. Home was about connection, to place, to purpose, to people. The mansion my family had once begged to stay in had served its purpose in our story. Now it was time to create something new, something that honored the past while embracing the future we were all building together, one day at a time. Standing on that bluff as twilight deepened, watching my once fractured family laughing together, under the emerging stars, I felt a sense of completion. The circle that began with rejection had closed with reconciliation. The journey hadn't been what any of us expected, but somehow, against all odds, it had led us exactly where we needed to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.